Hello there, and welcome to Weird Music on the Glumberger channel. The show where we of course take a different album each and every week, have a discussion about it in some way or form, maybe, I suppose, I don't know. So in today's episode, we're once again returning to Room 40, a label we've actually been exploring, a fair bit across this channel actually. And it's always one where each and every album we've dived into has just been this incredibly unique and existential listening experience in some way or form. And of course, this one is no different today in that respect, with it being an incredibly bizarre and surreal sound exploration of sorts, weaving together, many musical elements, but also with field recordings, spoken words, and just the abstract. And it just creates this incredible tapestry that just brings together so many points in time into one singular place. Maybe that'll make sense at some point in this video, who knows. In any case, I present A Necessary Softness by Alexandra Spence. So of course, let's ask ourselves, who is Alexandra Spence? Well, Alexandra Spence is an experimental artist and musician from Sydney, Australia. And across her various releases and live performances, I should also add, Spence has created a wonderful documentation of sound explorations of, the everyday itself, it feels. Now, when listening to the works of Alexandra Spence, there's this incredible intertwining quality amongst it all, which seems to often interpolate, elements of each other across, performances, installations, and even physical releases. It's incredibly strange and abstract, but it's easily some of the most rewarding music I've heard, especially when you discover just how far and wide each of it all goes, essentially. And it's all music or experiments, however you'd like to describe it. It's all stuff that straddles this really fine line between what is real and what is imaginary. And so, of course, we are diving into A Necessary Softness here, released on Room 40 back in 2021. And so this album comprises 4 different recordings, 2 long-form experimental tracks, and 2 shorter recordings of what I assume is just raw field recordings. We'll get into that later. And with this release, it feels like Spence has perfectly surmised so much of her concept when it comes to what it is she's trying to present with her music and her compositions. The album itself, blends together a large number of sound sources, from acoustic instruments to electronic loops to spoken word to field recordings, and even sourcing some particular sounds from live performances as well. All in all, though, it's actually a rather challenging experimental listening experience, but it's one that truly rewards a listener, not just willing to hear it, but also rewards those who want to discover more about it, just learn more and discover more, and hopefully this gives more context as well for people who want to know more. So, let's just dive into it, shall we? So we start off with the album's opener of Tidewater, a 17.5-minute sound exploration. And I don't know if I exactly understand the term electroacoustic music. I feel like this is, right? From the onset, where you're given acoustic passages of incredibly airy drones, sourced from what I am certain is the clarinet, which is, if you hadn't guessed, an absolute favourite instrument of mine. And these recordings of the clarinet are complete with the very inhaling and exhaling of the very air itself, it feels. Now, interestingly, I only noticed the occurrence of those breathy passages when I listened to this album on the physical release itself, on the very cassette here. And it's interesting because before long, with all these acoustic patches, these clarinet drones and stuff, you get these incredibly unusual resonating frequencies that start to accompany it, as the clarinet then just becomes looped and affected in very, very slight peculiar ways, it feels. And it's an incredibly hypnotising way to open up the entire set of this album, and it's weirdly interesting, I find, especially when it devolves into these high-pitched frequencies that seem to ring out with this really unusual decay that's like it's just crawling through your very mind itself, it feels. And there's something, weirdly enough, almost playful about it as well, and a weird sense of lowercase concrete to create the groundwork for the rising build of varying field recordings, which start placing us in the very epicenter of like underground stations or even the outdoors, it feels. What makes it really weird and interesting, though, is we then get a sort of narrative of spoken word, when Alexandra Spence reads aloud from, what I assume is an obscure book, A Sierra Club Naturalist Guide to the Pacific Northwest by Stephen Whitney. And with her voice just chatting away, essentially, it further pushes that hypnotizing set, and in a weird way, I find it very interesting how it makes me consider actual field recording and spoken word and the contrast between the two. Even with field recordings as well, like, it seems that they just capture this time and place with their literalness, if that makes sense. And here, it feels like Spence is contrasting that with her own voice, which is both literal, but then it becomes a bit more abstract the more this builds up, straddling the very fine line between the two states, as the voice then becomes this garbled nonsense mess, And what I love and find truly fascinating, though, is this build-up into this incredibly tumultuous bit where it just happens really gradually. It slowly just starts at the back, pushing itself towards the forefront of the composition, and it grabs those very field recordings and those spoken word passages, and it completely transforms them into the abstract itself. And especially with those constantly occurring loops, it feels completely stripped of context at this point, completely removed from anything tangible, and all you can really do is just sit there in a stunned daze and just wonder what the hell is even happening here.
Glaciers eventually retreated. The valleys were flooded by rising seas.
But even when it all fades away, it feels like we're coming back to normalcy in some way or form, especially when the composition, suddenly builds itself up into an incredibly electronic deluge of noisy tones. Feels a little bit like being slapped across the face, perhaps. something weirdly physical occurring as a result of just listening to the album, which I find truly fascinating. I truly adore hearing albums that produce very weird physical effects, and this is certainly one of them, I have to say. In any case, the whole composition, it all becomes incredibly incomprehensible. But as mentioned before, on so many albums previously, I find the sense of bafflement and bewilderment that occurs from hearing this type of music to be really fascinating. And to go back to the composition itself, it's nice and it's lovely how Spence is able to just, completely shift and change the landscape, bring it, into tumultuous areas and then bring it right back down to more naturalistic settings. And on this album, I love how it once again becomes that pull between the two states, especially when you get these lovely vocal hums occurring intermittently. It creates this really beautiful passage of music on the album. But one of my favourite bits, and I don't know why, but this bit truly delights me for some reason, is a spoken word passage from Alexandra Spence herself.
Hey, Jake and Lauren. I'm in Gastown, Vancouver, and I'm just walking you over to the steam clock right now, which has been voted, I think, the world's worst, or perhaps just Vancouver's worst tourist attraction.
And so, I'm kind of hoping you saw why I felt I had to play that one as it appears on the album, because it's the sounds of the world's worst tourist attraction. I think there's something weirdly funny about it. There's something amazingly funny about the way that Spence is just nonchalantly just messaging her friends and mentions her location of Vancouver's worst world tourist attraction. Like, why are you there? This sounds like this place sucks. Like, this place is the bad guy. But I just love how oddly humorous it is. There's just something so amusing about just this stark realness of just like, hey, here we are. This place, it's kind of lame. But then she follows it up with another comment on the very same location that I have to play as well.
So it actually seems like the steam clock was 5 minutes early in sounding, which means we're gonna have to wait another 10 to 13 minutes in front of Vancouver's worst tourist attraction until it sounds again.
So, I love deadpan humour for some reason. When Spence speaks, she mentions about how the clock is running slow, and as a result she has to wait even longer to even hear the bell ringing, further cementing that this place sucks. This tourist attraction, is the bad guy. But it's just amusing how this is all a part of the story as well, though, and it's lovely how it then fades back into these lovely vocal drones and quiet chorus of sounds, including just the dragging of cello strings, I believe, as well. And what it does is, especially after everything has occurred and we've listened to on this entire album, well, entire composition so far, you're left in this incredibly dazed stupor after it all. Like, you're just there trying to comprehend the very things that have happened and just being completely unable to do so. And so on the cassette, you get an effortless glide into the next track of Waves. And as you might have guessed, it is indeed the sound of waves. And there's something very calming and very serene about this track, with it just being the sound of the water, the movement of water itself, joined by the sounds of the world itself, the nature that exists all around, all at once, And especially after the tumultuous opener, it becomes such a gentle moment, I find, Even when a passing vehicle drifts off in the distance, there's still something really nice about just standing here in this particular location, wherever it may be. And so, another weird tangent to sort of go on. There's going to be a bunch of this in the video, has already been, and there'll be more. But I do wonder sometimes that it's kind of difficult on albums like this to tell what is literal and what isn't sometimes. as your mind just seems to wander around and interpret the sounds in different ways, from what it literally is to what it feels like to hear, to even what it reminds you of having heard before, if that makes sense. And I do always wonder how much of it has been affected, how much of it has been just left alone. Especially when you consider the album's first opener is this incredible experimental dirge, going into the second track of Waves, where it feels like just the sounds of natural field recordings. It's starkly different approaches to sounds themselves, it feels, and I wonder where, like, just as to what effect has even been done on the second track, if any, perhaps. And I feel like, you know, artists like Spence, perhaps they purposely blur this line, you know, just to sort of obscure the very explanation of what it is we're hearing sometimes, you know. And perhaps that's also a fascination about albums very much like this, though, that discovering the sounds themselves and just feeling those unique pulls wherever it may take you. So, moving swiftly along, we get to the album's second half, side B, which begins with the next track of Belle Fern, the second of the long-form compositions on this album. And so this very odd sound odyssey, another odd sound odyssey once again, it feels like a sort of intermittent occurrence of varying sound sources, from the sounds of breathing, the sound of moving objects, to the sounds of the weather itself sometimes. And sometimes it feels like these rather abstract musical notions, and at other times like a physical entity of sorts, one that slowly, you know, forms into these very shapes before the landscape suddenly gives way for the sound of bells, it feels. And with how the sound of the ringing occurs from time to time, and how it seems to vary in very different ways as well, like, I imagine there's perhaps a number of different types of bells being rung here, playing momentarily, some, others being caught in unusual delay effects that ping them across like sonar rays. And I find the more abstract rumbles that tend to be occurring, you know, to be really unusual to even comprehend at this point, especially with that rising droning frequency in the background again. It becomes very difficult to envision what is actually happening at times, whether it's the sound of recordings, you know, just reduced to terrifying lowercase instances even. And just when it feels like this composition is going to be entering an area of fear and discomfort, we're then once again joined by the sound of Spence once again reading aloud. This time though, rather than reading from another obscure source of sorts, it seems that Spence has written words of her own, which have been printed in the physical booklet for this cassette, and goes as follows. Gauzy construction cloth in green, yellow, white and blue. It swells and ripples in the wind. Bamboo scaffolding, somehow more obvious. Organic against inorganic materials. Lush, vibrant, green baby ferns. Small and waving in the breeze. A necessary softness after all. The hard concrete. Flashing orange construction lights. Orange against the hazy nighttime. Luminous blue, piles of rubble and floating plastic line the beaches. Dusty, grey, white, monotonous and bright candy colours. And so, in regards to the meaning of it, we'll try and come back to that later, I think. There's a lot to dissect on an album like this. So to go back to the composition, I have to say, I, for some reason, really like spoken word passages like this. Especially on this one, it starts off rather normally for the most part, before Spence then overloads the reading with more occurrences of her very voice reading the text, which reminds me of Let's Call It Fun Time by Paper Bull, an album we explored in a very early episode of Weird Music, where there was multiple voices all reading the same piece of script, if that makes sense. And then, well, what Spence does here as well, though, as well as creating a sort of similar tumultuous experience, it then is accompanied by this rising, frequency that seems to take over the whole composition, Even rewinding the tape, which does seem to occur at certain points, like the actual rewind of cassette tapes, it does nothing to alleviate the unsettling sequence. And I feel, just as easily as Spencer's guided track from turmoil to peace, it somehow finds its way back there again, turning into this cataclysmic build-up of noise before reducing it all back down once again. And I think it was roughly by this point that the state of comprehension when trying to listen to the physical release of this, I just had to give in to what was just being heard, just get pulled along by that strange soundscape. And it's because there's something so strangely hypnotizing about, the entire experience, I have to say. When it came to writing about this album, it's so difficult to comprehend your thoughts when you're hearing it, because it's such an overload of so many different things happening. And I tried my best to write so many of these thoughts when listening to the physical release on my little cassette player, and even then I was still just sort of blown away and stunned to the point of incomprehensibility. But I find that so fascinating, and it kind of reminds me, as well of that pull between constantly occurring states, if that makes sense. The real and the abstract, simultaneously joined together in harmony as well, as well as cancelling each other out on this very album, especially with how the actual musical elements sound. It starts off beautiful, then there's turmoil, then there's drones, there's low-case, there's static, there's thumps, and it's all just this constantly, simultaneously occurring experience that feels like it's just contrasting with each other, if that makes sense. It's all very peculiar. Of course, there is one final track to talk about on this album, and that is the last track of Rain. And so much how side A ended up, with what felt like literal field recordings at the end, as opposed to the long-form abstract composition that preceded it, A Necessary Softness ends itself on a very similar vibe, bringing back to nature itself as we simply just listen to the rain itself. And once again, there's just something nice about it for some reason. Now, maybe because it's arguably a bit more gentler sounding than the more experimental tracks, Something about these moments of respite, they feel so nice in the grand scheme of things. And as well, I have to mention, there is wonderful clarity to it as well, especially on this one. The rain occurs consistently as the birds cheep, the insects trill, and there's some sort of animal makes an odd sound that it's intermittently, oddly guttural, but it still feels very much like a part of the scenery itself, though. And though I cannot place a context on it, maybe it's a specific type of bird call, bird enthusiasts, let me know. But it's lovely to hear, and I love how this whole experimental album has concluded itself with just a simple, humble presentation, if that makes sense. And so, how does one start to summarise an album? This is one of those albums where I find so many different facets of it to be truly fascinating. From the onset of the album's opener of Tidewater, you're just immediately thrown into this very surreal soundscape that starts to draw from, arguably naturalistic sound sources before turning into the abstract in very unexplainable ways. Before it then ends on the lovely field recordings of waves. And then side B does an odd similar thing where it throws us into Belle Firm, a track that feels very much like a parallel to the opener of Tidewater, and they're exploring very similar notions of musical experimentation, albeit with perhaps a much different context, perhaps, in some respects. I mean, bear with me on this, because there's a lot of weird stuff to try and get into with this album. But, much like side A, the second side opens with those experimental notions of form and structure, almost, opening with an abstract recording interpolating the spoken word, the blending of field recordings, acoustic instrumentation, electronic interference, before it all then ends on gentle field recordings again. And I feel like it's one of those things where it's contrasting of each other, before being joined together in harmony. One of those albums where the more you think about it, the more you start to see those parallels running alongside each other throughout the entirety of this album. The normal, the abstract, constantly being pushed together and compared with each other, from the music itself to even the very presentation of it, of the cassette itself here as well. And it all just goes on and on like that, so on and so forth. And to go back to the poem, like I said we would try to do earlier in the video, I feel like, it kind of reinforces this sense of harmonious contradictions, is how I'd like to word it. This imagery of harsh concrete, harsh concrete structures set up against the lush backgrounds in nature that runs throughout the entirety of this poem of sorts, you know. Summed up in this observation of conflicting colours that I'd argue sums up a lot of this album as well, to be fair, you know. A lot of this album feels like monotonous dusty grey white in the form of the most peculiar lowercase drones, contrasted with the brighter colours of everything that feels so much more natural, to me, in the form of the field recordings or even the instrumental passages. A constant contrast and comparing of two different halves, it feels. I'll be honest, I'm not sure any of this is making any sense, truth be told. No, weirdly enough, when it comes to this sort of concept of conflicting concepts being brought together, I feel like this is something we've actually touched upon in previous episodes of Weird Music, but never really dug our teeth into much. And unusually, in many of those previous videos where we've been discussing such abstract concepts, I've always resorted to discussing the album's liner notes, as it's always without a doubt one of the best sources of context for such abstract recordings like these. Funnily enough, this is something that seems to always come up with Room 40 releases. Just a little humorous observation there. In any case, it's definitely worth discussing the liner notes for A Necessary Softness, as it really helps just piece together some of the fragmented concepts of this very album. And lucky for us, the very notes for the album comes from Alexandra Spence herself, who tells us the following. I have a near spiritual obsession with the animation of material and object through sound. A Necessary Softness is my attempt to hold onto and translate through sound this fascination with material, object and place. I like to imagine sound as a transient thread, unravelling and connecting our isolated homes, our objects, our bodies, degrading, changing form and leaving traces along the way. A Necessary Softness presents the shifting soundscapes of real and imagined places, tactile objects amplified to merge with sound made by resonant bodies and digital processing, slowly unravelling into ambient landscape. Tidewater and Belle Fern both began and were inspired by places in which I resided for a long, Vancouver, or a short time, Hong Kong. And both developed through performances presented over the past few years, beginning with a solo set at Destroy Vancouver in April 2016, intertwining in a performance at 20A in Hong Kong, June 2019, and solidifying with the launch of an album at Peter Shimbolo in Sydney, August 2019. A Necessary Softness is built of materials repeating and retelling. Two performances compositions with a shared synergy. In a way, Belle Fern was birthed from Tidewater, exploring its own narrative while sharing in Tidewater's structure. They exist in a kind of parallel binary form, and my intention is that the cassette may be played in either direction, while the digital fragmentation of the tracks allows for a more modular approach, chapters of a story to be entered into at any point. A Necessary Softness, over and over, in homage to material and place. And so, a lot to digest there, I feel. Now, this is usually a point where I remind people that I am no academic when it comes to these things. I'm purely just a music enthusiast trying to make sense of what it is I'm hearing and feeling and thinking when I hear music like this. And I have to say, I like how Spence has clearly defined the characteristics of this particular album, you know, explaining the abstract of transient sounds and what they're representing in this particular context. That, to be fair, takes into account where you might be in whatever particular place and time it is that you are hearing this very album as well. And as a result, it becomes such an incredibly peculiar existential experience as you listen to the music, because it's always shifting and changing in such weird little ways. And even as a listener itself, the context of where you are in that place and time, if that makes sense, really changes how you perceive things, if that makes sense sometimes. And as a result, it changes how this very album presents itself. I have to say though, perhaps one of the biggest pieces of context for me for this whole album though, was the mention of the solo performances in Vancouver 2016 and Hong Kong 2019. And so, after a bit of Googling, I actually found out some of these live performances are available to watch on YouTube, on Alexandra Spence's own channel. And when I came across these live performances from Spence, especially the one from Vancouver, a lot of the composition started to make so much more sense as we see the very sources of the sounds themselves in these very performances. The video for Vancouver, for example, which has probably been playing throughout this video as well at various points and stuff, it shows us a lot of the original context for the album's Tidewater, as in the performance, Spence loops, and performs very peculiar notes on the clarinet before that swelling, noisy interference starts to take over, which seems to seemingly be sourced from the laptop and mixing pedals, perhaps. But there's odd little differences, of course, with the performance being very organic in its development of sounds and loops, and yet it still ties into the later composition of Tidewater in so many different ways, I feel. It's perhaps worth quickly mentioning, though, the actual credits of what's being played here, as the information as such isn't on the cassette. But in the description for the video, we're told a full rundown of what it is Spence is playing on this particular performance, which tells us: quadraphonic performance featuring voice, clarinet, heartbeat, no input mixer, YVR traffic control livestream, AM/FM radio, tapes, field recordings and samples, Vancouver, Victoria Ferry, tourist getting directions, Sydney, Australia, Rebecca Bruton playing violin, Crab Beach at dusk, fish frying, rolling marble, feedback, bus ride along East Hastings on cassette. And so I wanted to mention this as I love this defining characteristic of the smorgasbord of sound sources that Spence is drawing from. As well as the fact there's a lot being played here that isn't even on the cassette as well, making it a further exploration into that very peculiar sound world itself, it feels. And then it's also worth mentioning the other live performance on Spence's channel, Live at Sound Force Festival 2019 in Hong Kong, which might be one of the sources for for more sounds that we hear on the album, both maybe on Tidewater or even on Belle Firm, which tells us Spence plays the following: bowls of water, hydrophone, wind-up penguin, shells, marble, small glass bottle, tuning forks, field recordings, no input mixer, cassette tapes, buried tape loops, transducer on a biscuit tin. And so once again, another incredibly abstract live performance that pulls together such an unusual tapestry from such an array of sound sources, of course. But I love how it gives us the context, of Spence sourcing sounds for her performances from so many different facets of life, from the mundane everyday objects all around you, to instruments, from being in the moment in time itself with your own voice, to old loops of sounds, to being in frequencies, and interpolating those very performances in some ways to process itself into the construction of this very album itself. I don't know, but I think it's so fascinating as a result. And what I like about it as well, it gives us, something that feels so incredibly connected to so many different aspects of life itself, be it the recording process for Spence, or the performing process, or the sourcing of those very experiences from Alexandra Spence's everyday, going about on buses and walking around Sydney, Australia, or even Hong Kong, anywhere, Vancouver, and sourcing all these different sounds and stuff. And then even, for us, the listening of this very album in our isolated places wherever they may be around the world. I think, in a weird way, this is perhaps, some of what Spence is trying to explain and express in the very notes for this album, though. The sense of sound as this interconnective source between so many people, places, and objects themselves. A rather abstract notion, but I truly believe that Spence has explored it so fascinatingly on this album that tells us the story of Spence's relationship to sound and music. Very cool, I feel. And I have to say, it is an incredibly challenging and experimental release, But yet there's these lovely, incredibly intimate moments as well that perhaps sums up that necessary softness existing in such a harsh, cold world, it feels. And so with that, I think we might as well just be coming to the end of our episode of Weird Music there. Such a strange album to have tried to dive into, and it's one that still, like, you know, bends my brain even just thinking about the abstract of, but one of my favourite albums I've come across off Room 40, like one of my favourites, and one I'm really glad to have the physical cassette release for, I have to say. And I'm just glad to have talked about Alexandra Spence on the channel, you know. I'm truly fascinated at the existential expression of sound itself in this album that, you know, manages to, at times, places between reality and the abstract itself. But yeah, it's so incredibly weird, but and I still think it is rather incomprehensible to explain the true breadth of this album, but sometimes that's just the way it is. Like, one of those things as well, like, it's just down to how you as an individual listener feel, what you draw from these things, of course, as well, and perhaps that's the very point that Spence is making with her compositions and stuff. And so with that, I would like to thank you for watching today's, you know, very weird episode of Weird Music. I wish you all the best, take care, and bye-bye for now. Bye-bye.
Popping, cicadas. Rocking boats, hot metal popping, cicadas. Rocking boats, hot metal popping, cicadas. Rocking boats, hot metal popping, cicadas.